Well, good evening, everyone. I appreciate the feedback you gave me. I asked you a question at the end of class last week regarding slides, no slides, how y'all kind of preferred to watch these videos. And in the process, got a couple of other bits of feedback. And so I'm going to try something different this week and give you a heads up about it and let you respond to this as well. Right now, I am recording a video earlier for tonight. One of the things that was said this week was that somebody preferred to watch the video after it had finished streaming so that they could pause, stop, go back, take notes. And that's all perfectly well and good with me. Recording takes a fraction more effort, but I can do it any point during the day. And if y'all kind of agree that you like the ability to pause, rewind, instead of following it live, then that's perfectly fine with me. It's still going to post at 7 o'clock. Obviously, you're watching this about 7 o'clock this week, and I am not recording it at 7 o'clock, a little bit earlier than that. So, the thing that I liked about live streaming was that you had an option in the midst of the stream to ask questions if you wanted to type them into the column, but I can't remember the last time anybody did that. So, you can still ask questions. If you would like, call me, text me, email me, pop them into the comments of this video, and I will do my best to respond to them as they come. But if this kind of works for you and you like the non-live option where you can pause, rewind, then, give me that feedback and we'll see how it goes. It may not be the same week to week. The material will be the same week to week. We are continuing on in our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We are in the meat of the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we started with the beginning of a section often called the antithesis, which is a bad title for the section, but it's how they've long been known, where Jesus starts each kind of short teaching with, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And this week we are continuing on those teachings. All of these verses, the ones that we looked at last week and the ones that we're looking at this week, deal with relationships. So again, just a quick rundown of the Sermon on the Mount and how I think we can most effectively read it. One, if you've not done so already, read it all the way through. Beginning to end, no stops. Read it the way that it's meant to be read and heard. All of these pieces are part of, I don't like the phrase puzzle, but they're part of a painting. It's a much bigger picture that they're painting, and they play off of each other. These are not small isolated teachings that are meant to be taken apart from each other. They're meant to be viewed as a part of the whole. Two, I think we have to pay attention to what this is. If Moses on the mount came down with the 10 Commandments, Jesus on this mount is laying down, guidelines to live by. This is discipleship in action at its very core. These are the teachings that should shape the lives of disciples. This is a manual on discipleship. And Jesus kind of breaks it down when he teaches it into building pieces. So at the beginning, it's, discipleship starts with a changed perspective. And when you experience all of these different experiences in life, how you view them says a lot about your level of commitment to Christ, with that your level of discipleship investment. And then he talks about why discipleship matters. You are salt and you are light. And if you're not going to do the discipleship thing, then you are depriving the world of salt and light, of life, of the things that will shape it in a positive way. And then finally, as one last piece of introduction before he gets into the meat of the teaching, he makes sure that his audience understands that this is not something brand new, that discipleship stands in the long line of what God has been doing amongst God's people. I did not come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. The law matters, and how you live in light of it matters. We're just going to put the emphasis in a little bit different place than on the keeping of the literal rules themselves versus the heart of what sits behind them. Discipleship is rooted in God's intention for humanity, not in the letter of the law itself. And then last week we looked at verses 21 through 26, teachings about anger. And tonight we pick up in verse 27, and I'm not entirely sure how many of these I'm going to try and get through. I've prepped a good chunk of them, but I also know that nobody really wants to watch a video that goes for 55 minutes. So if I can pull them all off in a manageable time, then we'll cover as much ground as we can, and if we can't, then at some point I will just shut up and say next week is part 2. So I want to start kind of with that backgrounder as we continue on these teachings about how genuine discipleship affects our relationships, shapes our relationships. We'll pick up in chapter 5, verse 27. So here we go. You have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So if your eye, even your good eye, right eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for the whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, right hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. You have heard that the law says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce, but I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. And I'm going to pause right there because those kind of deal with the marriage relationship aspects of this teaching. And I also want to pause there because I think it's important to recognize that historically these passages fall into some of those traditional clobber passages we've used to beat people who didn't make choices that we liked at some point or another in their relationships. And I think one of the things that I want to make sure that we have to be honest with ourselves about is if we are going to bring a literal reading to adultery and divorce and those sort of things here, then I think we have to apply the same level of literalness to the other stuff that we read. And when we look at that, it becomes very obvious that we do not do that. So to suggest that lust is a part of the life of the vast majority of human beings at some point or another, I think is a successful thing, or an accurate thing to say. And yet, plenty of faithful Christians who have been tempted significantly at some point or another still have their eyes and their limbs because they looked at this passage and understood that you're intended to read this seriously but not necessarily literally. The extreme nature of the statement is designed to get you to stand up and take notice and pay attention to the severity of what's going on because it's pointing to the root of the matter that exists behind it. And one of the mistakes that we've made in reading the Bible, literally where we want to and figuratively where we want to, but with no real clear reason why we pick the ones that we do along the way, is because very often we're comfortable with calling out the struggles and sins of others, especially visible ones, all while trying to bury our own. And the Sermon on the Mount leaves literally no room for us to do that. Because what it constantly presses us to do is to look at the heart behind the issue and start dealing with the failures and struggles that exist there. The other thing is, depending on which gospel you're reading when Jesus gives this teaching, like Matthew gives a, with the exception of unfaithfulness, I think Luke does not. If not Luke, Mark does not. The reason I point that out is because at the time that Jesus was doing ministry, this was a loud, ongoing conversation amongst followers of God in the Jewish community. It had been a loud, ongoing conversation before Jesus was born. Classic schools of rabbinic or Pharisaic Judaism, the schools of Shammai and Hillel, had ongoing disagreements over a particular passage in Deuteronomy, one that provides outline for when divorce is permissible. And what the Deuteronomic passage says, essentially, in Hebrew, is if he finds... Woman could not divorce a man. So, sorry, women, your property as far as the Old Testament was concerned. So you don't have a say in this one. But a man could bail on his wife the way that Deuteronomy reads it, for some indecency, is how it's often translated. But the word itself does not lend directly to sexual immorality. It's if you find something objectionable about her. Well, that's a really vague guideline, and so the schools of Shammai and Hillel, often at odds with each other, argued over what those lines would be, with one saying that it was only permissible in the case of sexual immorality of some sort or another on the woman's part, and the other saying, well, in something objectionable is really wide, and so he can divorce her for anything that he finds objectionable about her, including if she burns his toast, can't cook his breakfast. He can leave her for that. Jesus is, in some ways, participating in that ongoing conversation here. And in other ways, reminding them that the conversation itself is not the point. You can see, starting with the writing teaching about anger that we looked at last week, that what Jesus is really trying to get at is the heart, the emotion, the responsive reaction of people. And since those are the things that drive the sin and the failure in our lives, he's asking disciples, followers, to pay attention to that part. The same is true here when he talks about adultery, starting with conversation around lust. And lust is not simply noticing that somebody else is attractive or anything like that. Lust is the type of drive that pushes you to act on your feelings. In the same way that being bothered by somebody's comments is not the anger that's being talked about in verse 21, so much as feeling the desire inside of you to punch them in the face is. And then when we talk about divorce, what we're looking at there is, again, in all of these passages, a push away from selfishness. And you might wonder what I mean by that. But divorce in the ancient world and relationships in the ancient world are not all that similar to the modern world in a number of very important ways. And part of that has to do with the status of women, which I've already referenced, and I apologize that it comes off so callous the way that women are talked about in the Old Testament. But when we're dealing with what we have, we're dealing with what we have. So if a man were to divorce his wife, since women can't really sue for divorce even in the New Testament during times of Jesus in the Jewish world, with some exceptions for royalty, then what we have to recognize is that when a man divorces his wife, he is essentially, in this world, leaving her completely vulnerable and lost in the society at large. He has taken away her source of income, her status, the roof over her head, everything. A deeply selfish act. And so while there is some allowance for relationships to cease in an official capacity due to them being broken beyond repair, what Jesus essentially does here is remind us, husbands especially, we can apply it differently in the modern world to both parties, but in this case specifically, reminding husbands that they have a responsibility to not abandon someone to the world around them. And that might require some effort on their part, some forgiveness, some willingness to put up with burnt toast if you're in the school of Hillel, or some willingness to recognize that it does not simply have to be your way all the time. Again, some differences, but an applicable teaching. In marriage, we know we have to, if they're going to be functional and fundamentally sound, have to set aside the selfishness that rises up inside of us because there's another person involved. In the ancient world, even more so, and very much one-sided. But that's kind of what Jesus is working with here. And then I really have a difficult time, and commenters in general have a difficult time, with the second line in the teaching on divorce: anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. Because remarriage was very often the way that a woman who has been abandoned by her first husband, finds security, safety, and a place in the world at large. And I think that what that passage is really getting at is a push. And again, we're reading some other stuff as if it's overstatement, like the whole gouging out your eye, cutting off your hand thing. What Jesus is really pushing them for is to understand the depth of their commitment and the necessity of honoring that relationship. With some room, much like everything else we're reading, the understanding that those relationships matter. They mean something. And how you carry yourself in those relationships says a lot about the depth of your faithfulness and your commitment, your willingness to sacrifice, which, is sort of a key part of following Jesus, though they're only learning that at the time that this teaching is coming down. All right, second half for tonight. I am going to continue on because I think we're doing okay timeline-wise. Verses 33 through 48. And so if the first couple we're talking about deep familial committed relationships, we now start looking at relationships between friends, between neighbors, and between adversaries, between those with power over us, and between those who are dependent on us. So a very wide range of relationships in a very short number of verses. So again, we're going to take these as a chunk and then talk about them for a few minutes. Verse 33 of chapter 5, "You have also heard that our ancestors were told, 'You must not break your vow. You must carry out the vows you've made to the Lord. But I say, do not make any vows. Do not say by heaven, because heaven is God's throne, and do not say by earth, because the earth is his footstool, and do not say by Jerusalem, for Jerusalem is the city of the great King David. Do not even say by my head, for you can't turn one hair white or black. Just say a simple, yes I will, or no I won't. Anything beyond this is from the evil one. You have heard that the law that says that punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat also. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it too. Give to those who ask. Do not turn away from those who want to borrow. You have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. For if you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. So again, we look at several different types of relationships that are being brought into view by Jesus here in the midst of these teachings. First, just in general, when you make commitments, do you keep those commitments? And it's interesting to look at the statement about vows. And one of the ways that it's been applied historically is people who say they're not allowed to take oaths. You still see this very rarely, but occasionally in courts of law where people won't place their hand on the Bible or take an oath because in this passage is often what's looked back to. And that's not really what Jesus is talking about here. Swearing by the heavens and by earth, those were common kind of production statements that you would try to emphasize how committed you were to something or other, or how certain your word could be. I swear by the heavens. I swear by the... And Jesus says your word shouldn't require a production. And very often those types of overstatements were simply public theater. Or at least it was common for overstatements to be a part of, public theater. They were for the value of others, much in the same way that the publican's prayer is for others. Jesus says none of that is necessary. Genuine discipleship shows up when people know that you will honor your word, and they do not need all of the fluff that goes with oaths in our world to believe you, to trust that you are a person of your word. There's some interesting comments that I could make about turning hair white or black, because hair dye in the ancient world was both really terrible and really common. It's one of those things that I wish I could go back and just see what the styles of ancient Rome were like, because powdering your hair white or attempting to dye it black were and I'm just got lovely videos of like sweating, color on a sweltering day, humid too, around the Mediterranean. Yeah, that'd be really funny, but that's not neither here nor there. I love that Jesus kind of calls them out for it, though. You can't actually turn it one way or the other. You just kind of change it for a short period of time. Underneath, it's still there. And maybe that's an image that's intentional there. For all of the attempts in the ancient world to practice some method of hair dyeing, they couldn't permanently change the color of their hair. Underneath it all was still the person. And again, some of these colloquialisms that get lost in Scripture that would have been common sayings at the time, we don't always pull out. Maybe there's something to that here, but there's this reminder that underneath it all, underneath the fluff, underneath the production, underneath the outward appearance, there is still you. And if that you isn't trustworthy, isn't dedicated, then all of the fluff in the world doesn't make a difference. And then continuing on in verse 38, you have heard the law that says that punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to the one who asks, and do not turn away from those who want to borrow. So here we see two very different kind of groups of people, those with power over you and those who are reliant on you. Power over, I think, is pretty obvious in the first 3 examples: the one who slaps you, the one who sues you, and the one soldier who demands you carry for gear. Now, the right cheek comment is interesting, because what that essentially depicts is an insulting slap, kind of a backhand to the cheek. And so when Jesus says turn your other cheek also, it would be turned for a much more violent strike. Jesus essentially says take the insults. So the opposite of that would be to return insult for insult. Another thing that Jesus talks about in another place, and says you do not return insult for insult. And then looking at the case of even just the first line, talking about eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The Old Testament law was designed to limit, to place limits on revenge. Maybe that's the best way to say it. And I think we understand the danger that revenge brings to escalation, things becoming worse. So they took my eye, I'm going to take 2. And you can see escalating revenge in multiple places throughout the Bible, throughout the Old Testament, where there is an evil act that's done, and then the response is above and beyond, and then the response to that goes beyond that. But you know this just by watching children. I see this on a regular basis in our house, where one child is bothered by something the other child does, so they rip a toy out of the hand, and the response to the toy being taken is to push, and the response to being pushed is to push back harder, and the response to that is to hit, and the response to that is to cry and call for mom or dad. That escalation is kind of built into seeking revenge. And so Old Testament law placed limits. If there's something happens and your right eye is gouged out, you can do no more than do the same to them. But what Jesus does here is dial that back significantly. If they slap you on the right cheek, you can slap them on the right cheek. Would be a traditional understanding of acceptable revenge. And Jesus says no. And then you get the second image of basically a person standing naked in court, which is humorous to say the least, where somebody sues you and they take from you the shirt. There is kind of the undercloak, the thing that was worn all the time. And I don't want to describe ancient fashion to you, but the closest I can get is when they say sue you and take your shirt. It's this kind of long one piece of cloth that kind of wrapped around and formed both top and bottom underwear layer, and then the cloak was the outerwear that went around it. So if somebody sued you and took your shirt, your underwear, then you were still covered. You could still stay warm at night, and in fact the law, the Old Testament law, did not allow for the taking of the cloak, because how else would somebody stay warm at night? It had to be returned by sundown. And in this case, Jesus says, if they sue you and take one, just go ahead and offer the other as well. Which again seems strange and extreme, and I think I would hesitate to disrobe in court for any number of reasons, mostly not wanting additional charges filed on me in the process. But there is that built-in notion that this is somebody taking advantage of you. Jesus has dealt with previously in the Sermon on the Mount court cases where there is a actual infraction on your end. Apologize, settle it, take care of it. In this case, we get the idea that there is no actual infraction. This is some lawsuit run amok, that somebody with power over you, with better standing in the community, is taking advantage of you. And Jesus says, essentially, reveal the absurdity of the situation. You don't have to fight back with your fists. You don't have to scream and stamp your feet in court. If this is how they are going to operate, if they're going to sue your underwear off of them, okay. With your actions, you can reveal the absurdity of the whole situation. Just like turning the other cheek, and just like going the second mile with the soldier who forces you to carry this load for them. It's very likely that you've heard before that soldiers in the ancient world, Roman soldiers, could force non-Roman citizens. So if you were a Roman citizen, they couldn't really do this to you, but if you weren't, so be it. They could force you to carry their pack 1 mile. And so there was apparently this common practice of like setting stones a certain distance from your house, so that once you had once you reached the stone, you knew you had been forced to do it for as far as you had to, and you could set it down and be done. And Jesus says, if they force you to do that, keep going. Again, this is not one of those things where you're just doing it out of the kindness of your heart. Like this soldier, man, he's got a long journey and he needs somebody to carry his pack, and I'm going to bounce it around for them. If you were a Jewish person, you did not want that Roman soldier in your area at all. This is, as far as you're concerned, an occupying force, a foreign enemy. You do not care to have them around. And you know, some of your compatriots are actively killing these guys out in the countryside and starting mini revolutions. Why on earth would you help them in any way, form, or fashion? And again, this act of carrying the pack a second mile reveals the absurdity of the entire situation. If somebody's going to leverage you for it, okay. And that can get pretty uncomfortable for us, because what we essentially have here are situations where Jesus tells his disciples that it's okay to be taken advantage of. And I think that makes us uncomfortable, but what I would point out is that I think deeper underneath this, it has to be a recognition that it is better to be taken advantage of than to be the one taking advantage of somebody else. Because the last two examples, give to those who ask and do not turn away from those who want to borrow, reverses the situation a little bit. Instead of being the one with no power, you are suddenly the one who can leverage, who can force. And Jesus says, don't. Don't take advantage of your situation. Be selfless. Be willing to give sacrificially, to loan sacrificially. And in another place, don't expect back when you do, which again can be really difficult. but the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount are not easy teachings. And genuine discipleship, committed following of Christ, often is counter to what we think we would like to do. All right, and then the final section, and I am encroaching on a time that I want to be done, so I'm going to try and work quickly here. You have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. And then this is the line that I want you to pay attention to most, 45. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. That is a Deuteronomic line through and through. If you look back in the book of Deuteronomy, very often at the end of laws, it says something to the effect of, so that you will be sons of your Father in heaven, so that you will be children of God. That was the stated goal over and over and over throughout the law. And here it shows up in the midst of Jesus' teaching about this sort of selfless, sacrificial living, where you don't insist on having things your way, that you don't use what power you have to leverage others to benefit yourself, that when you are leveraged by others, that you don't fight it kicking and screaming, that you find ways to reveal the absurdity of the situation, that you don't insist on having things exactly the way that you want them to. And then the reminder at the end of all of it is, if these standards aren't the ones that we are looking towards, if we settle for loving our neighbor and hating our enemy and returning insult for insult, fighting back those who annoy us, escalating in revenge, then we're not doing anything that even the most corrupt person around us isn't doing. And we like to think that because it's us, we're doing better than others. But at the heart that exists under it all, whether we deem someone else's actions more evil than ours or whatever, if the root of that is still the selfishness that's so often present in us, then we're acting with the same motivation. Jesus says even corrupt tax collectors do that. If you lend only to your friends, how are you different than anyone else? Even the pagans do that. We are called to something different, and it's challenging, and it doesn't always make sense, and it's often counterintuitive. But at the end of the day, we're reminded that to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven looks very differently than being citizens of any earthly kingdom. That to live by God's standards look very different than what we often strive for as citizens of Spokane, of Washington, of the United States, of wherever you're watching this from. And even the things that we consider most just in our world are very often not in line with biblical principles that push us towards sacrificial giving and forgiveness. And the other thing I would point out is that even the harshness of some of the Old Testament laws were not always recognized or were not always pursued by even the most devoted lawkeeper in the Old Testament or during the time of Jesus. There are so many laws in the Old Testament that call for the death penalty, and yet very rarely do you see it pursued. The image of the people dragging the woman before Jesus and holding stones ready to stone her doesn't hold up. I don't think they had stones in their hands because they knew they couldn't stone her. They're putting Jesus in the spot to make decisions, and they couldn't stone her in town anyway. If they were going to do it, they were going to have to take her outside of the town, where there would have been way more stones present. Instead, there's this recognition, but that act reveals something that goes against Jesus' teachings here. The use of another person for position or leverage, not for any sort of good, not to benefit them, not to bring about their own reconciliation or healing, but for their abuse. And so I think as we read through the Sermon on the Mount, what we looked at last week, what we looked at this week, and before we dive into the prayer next week, more comments about giving to those who are in need around us, what we are invited to is an insistence that we learn to insist that we do not have to have everything our way. We don't have to have control over all of our resources. We do not have to have final say about everything that happens around us. We don't have to have things even or fair, so often the things that define what we want to pursue. Instead, what we have to have is the heart of God. And I know that's a big picture idea, but that really is at the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. All right, glad that you are with us tonight. I'm going to call it. We will pick up at the beginning of chapter 6. We will not have a video next Wednesday. I am on vacation. I don't think we're going to have a video next Wednesday. I'm on vacation, and I don't think I'm going to get a chance to do one with some of the other stuff that we're going to have in line. If we have one, you'll have a surprise video next Wednesday. If not, we'll pick it up in 2 weeks when I'm back in town, and we will keep cranking along with the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospel of Matthew as a whole. All right. Again, if you have any questions, comments, feel free to email me, call me, text me. You can always write me a letter and snail mail me. I'm good with any of those. If not, I'll see you next time.